My name is Gabriella. I am 38 years old and work as an architect in the city of Boston. All my life I have tried to be decent and composed, not fighting anyone for anything. Yet in the very moment my younger brother Jacob stepped up the aisle to the sound of soft music, my name was called onto the stage, not to speak or to offer congratulations, but to be made a public spectacle. In the lavish wedding hall, the spotlights shone directly on me while my new sister-in-law Natalie stood at the microphone, her voice trembling with tears. This woman has tried to ruin our marriage, out of jealousy. The room fell silent for a few seconds before a low murmur spread through the crowd. Some people looked at me with pity. Others sneered as if they had just watched a dramatic scene on stage. I stood frozen amid the accusing stares. Then from the back of the room a stranger rose and stepped forward. He pulled out a stack of documents and, in a warm, measured voice, said, "I think everyone should hear the rest of the truth. Have you ever been cast as the villain in front of your own family? Have you ever kept silent and endured until a stranger spoke up for you at exactly the right moment? If you have been in a similar situation, leave a comment below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. Because the story I'm about to tell you has only just begun. When I was a child, I assumed all families were like mine. I thought every kid had to fix their own bottles, soothe themselves to sleep, and learn how to comfort themselves when a parent reserved a gentle look for someone else. But as I grew up, I realized that was not the norm. I was born in a 2-story house in the suburbs of Massachusetts, where the backyard always filled with sunlight and the lavender my mother planted scented the window boxes. From the outside, the house looked peaceful like a picture, but inside the chill didn't come from the temperature. It came from being treated as an outsider. In 3rd grade, I won first place in a district-wide math contest. My teacher called home excited, saying I had a special gift. That evening I came home holding my award, hoping to see my mother smile the way she did when she told stories about Jacob learning to crawl or reading his first word. Instead, she just nodded and said, "That's fine. But you should help me watch Jacob and not get too carried away with those things." Jacob was only 2 then, and from the moment he was born I practically disappeared from my parents' view. My father had always wanted a son, and he didn't need to say it out loud. He showed it in every gesture. When Jacob was old enough to understand stories, my father started taking him to baseball games and bought him an expensive collection of model cars. As for me, wearing last year's coat, I quietly washed dishes after dinner or rode my bike to the market to help my mother, as if that were my only role. One year Jacob smashed the TV screen while playing with his remote control car. My parents didn't scold him. They scolded me for not watching him carefully. When I protested, my mother said, "You're the older sister. Older sisters must know how to give way." That phrase became an invisible cord tightening around me throughout my childhood. The older sister had to be quiet, to sacrifice, to stand in the background. I used to believe that if I studied hard and behaved properly, they would see me. But high grades never earned praise, scholarship awards were never celebrated. When I got into college on a full scholarship, my father only remarked, "Good. Then you won't have to ask us for money." I started working part-time at 16. First at a small corner bookstore, then as a server at a Mexican restaurant. Meanwhile, Jacob got a new car when he entered high school, private tutors for the SAT paid for by our parents, and summer camps in Colorado. I used to look at my brother's brand new suitcase with a pang in my chest. I wasn't jealous of the material things. I resented the attention, the favors, the affection I never reached. One night I came home late from a shift at the restaurant, exhausted with aching legs. When I walked into the kitchen, my mother was laughing with Jacob because he'd just made the school basketball team. I quietly opened the fridge to find something to eat. My mother glanced over and didn't ask if I was tired. She just said, "Don't let the smell of food cling to the house clothes." I said nothing, only nodded and went upstairs. Days like that piled up and I learned to close the door inside myself. Jacob knew he was loved by our parents. He didn't hide it. Sometimes while I was washing dishes, he'd walk by whistling and throw out a remark. "Poor you, sis. Keep doing that and who'll notice?" I used to squeeze my hands until my fingernails hurt just to avoid answering. I didn't want to make trouble. But that bitterness seeped into a dark streak in my memories that couldn't be washed away. I went to architecture school in Boston, 3 hours drive from home. That distance felt like freedom. I rented a tiny room, working 3 jobs at once. Mornings serving coffee, afternoons staffing the library, nights doing freelance interior design. Every dollar I earned came from sweat and time. I paid my own tuition, rent, and books. When Jacob went to college, my parents threw a big party, hired a photographer, and invited the whole neighborhood. I was called home only to help in the kitchen. When I refused to stay and wash dishes after the party, my mother looked at me as if I were an ungrateful stranger. "Don't you know how to love your brother? He's the family's only hope," she said. I remember very clearly turning away in silence, my chest empty like an abandoned room. From then on, I stopped going home for holidays. I poured myself into work and became one of the young architects mentioned in the sustainable construction field. I was once featured in a professional magazine, but my parents never asked what I was working on. That was fine. I thought maybe some families are not meant to love each other but to learn how to let go. I was wrong. I could never have imagined that after all those years of silent endurance, those very people could stand in the middle of a grand reception and point at me saying, "She's jealous, so she tried to sabotage our wedding." I stood there under blinding lights and suspicious glances. My heart felt like a stone. But I wasn't alone this time. A voice called out from the back of the room, "If Gabriella is the one sabotaging things, then I'm afraid you're believing a story that's been staged." All eyes shifted to the man, the stack of papers in his hand and a directness in his gaze. I froze when I recognized him as Daniel, an old colleague I had worked with on a historic building renovation project in Vermont. No one knew I had helped him expose a contractor who was skimming funds from that project. No one knew I had once saved his company from bankruptcy. Daniel, the man standing there, was the one person who had truly seen me and believed in me. He stepped closer, speaking clearly and decisively. "I think everyone should know who is actually lying here." Daniel stood under the soft amber glow of the wedding hall, his posture straight, his gaze sharp as if he'd never belonged to that artificial space. The air seemed to thicken. Every head turned toward him, even Jacob and Natalie involuntarily taking a step back. I wasn't surprised he was there. Daniel was one of the few people who had watched me work 42-hour stretches to save a project from collapse. He was the one who'd quietly left a box of chocolates for me on the day the company threw a recognition party I wasn't invited to attend. He understands me in ways my own family never wanted to. Natalie spoke up, trying to keep calm but her voice betraying a tremor. "Who are you? This is my family matter. I don't see why you think you have the right to intervene." Daniel didn't answer at once. From his briefcase he took out a thick envelope and walked toward the decorated table with the microphone. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate so everyone could hear. "I'm someone who has watched Gabriella get dragged into family affairs she never chose. I also just received a set of documents from the law office Whitaker Cole regarding unusual transfers from the Davis Family Trust, meaning the bride and groom's grandparents' trust, to a personal account in Jacob's name." Jacob's face tightened as he snapped, "Don't slander me. Who are you anyway? What does this have to do with you?" Daniel looked directly at my brother and replied softly, "This is about fairness and about the dignity of a woman who has been dragged through the mud without mercy." I stood silently, not resisting. I wanted to hear everything the man before me was about to reveal. I needed it like a breath after years of feeling invisible. Just a few months before the wedding, I had come home because my mother had slipped in the garden. The late evening call came. My father said only, "Come home, your mother needs you." I left a meeting with investors in New Haven and took the night bus back to the old suburban house I thought I'd never enter again. The white wooden fence still had chipping paint, and the geraniums hung in their pots like they had 2 decades earlier. But nothing weighed on me like the heavy, dark wood door that was always wide open for my brother and only slightly ajar and cold when I returned. I remember that cloudy day. After helping my mother into a chair and changing her bandage, I quietly went outside to fetch an ice pack. As I passed the study, I heard my father's voice low inside. "If the marriage with Natalie goes smoothly, this house will belong to them. Gabriella, she doesn't need it." I stopped, hardly daring to breathe. My mother answered in a tone as matter-of-fact as if discussing a piece of furniture. "She lives alone and has no family. Let her manage her affairs. It will only be more trouble. This house should go to the next in line." I stood behind the door, my legs turned to stone. It wasn't the inheritance that hurt. I never expected an inheritance. I never planned to return to this house. What squeezed my heart was how easily the two people who brought me into this world could erase me from their own family story, as if I had never existed. That night I slept on the living room couch. My mother didn't ask about my new project. My father didn't ask about my well-being. Jacob wasn't there, probably busy planning some seaside engagement photos. I left the house the next morning without a goodbye. No one said thank you. Daniel scanned the wedding hall, then turned to Natalie. You've spun a tale about a jealous, selfish woman destroying happiness. But the evidence I have shows the opposite. Jacob secretly used the heir designation to take loans under his grandparents' name. And I'm afraid, Natalie, you know about this. Natalie went pale. A few people began whispering, some phones raised to record, cameras flickering again. Jacob moved forward to snatch the documents, but Daniel stepped aside and handed them to the venue manager. These documents have been legally verified. If necessary, we can present them in a formal meeting with the trust's attorney. No one spoke for several seconds. Natalie pursed her lips and looked around in panic. Jacob bowed his head, clenching his fists. My parents sat motionless. My mother looked at me, then turned away. No apology. No sign of remorse. Daniel looked at me. For the first time since all this began, his voice softened. Gabriella, I'm sorry to bring this up on what should be a happy day. But I cannot stand by while the truth is twisted. I nodded slowly. Inside I felt neither anger nor a longing for apology. I just felt a clarity that had been buried for years finally unveiled, like a long-awaited rain washing the old dust from a window. A few guests left. Some stayed, faces awkward. Natalie fumbled with her phone trying to call someone, but the signal was weak. Jacob said something to our father and the two of them retreated backstage. I remained still, saying nothing. I didn't need to. Daniel had spoken for me. I still remember the night Jacob first brought Natalie home to meet the family. It was less a dinner and more a staged display of fashion and power, choreographed down to the smallest detail. My mother made beef bourguignon, a dish she rarely prepared except for truly important occasions. My father opened a vintage bottle of red wine, one he'd kept in the cellar for years as if welcoming a distinguished guest rather than his son's girlfriend. Natalie arrived exactly on time, her blonde hair curled softly, heels clicking rhythmically across the wooden floor. She entered with a flawless smile and a voice that mixed politeness with a certain affected manner. I sat in the corner of the table, always the place for those who aren't very important, trying to stay neutral. I wanted to observe her calmly, not react out of the defensive posture my mother had taught me when meeting strangers. The conversation initially revolved around dull topics like Natalie's college, her family's vacation home in Vermont, and the polo parties she had attended with her parents. My father laughed constantly, and my mother cast affectionate glances toward her future daughter-in-law as if she had dreamed of Natalie for years. Then the moment that stays with me occurred. When my father mentioned my work, reluctantly as if to fill a gap in the conversation, Natalie cocked her head and narrowed her eyes, sizing me up. Oh, Gabriella is an architect? She smiled lightly and continued, I've always admired people who can live independently. Still, I heard from Jacob that you live alone. It must be lonely in the city, right? Her words were as light as a breeze, but they landed on the dinner table like a stone thrown into a still lake. I looked straight at Natalie and caught the eager glint behind her mascaraed lashes. That was not admiration. It was a social slap. Jacob laughed as if nothing noteworthy had happened. My parents didn't respond. They simply kept pouring wine as if my presence wasn't important enough to defend. I offered a small, polite nod instead of a reply, then silently cut a piece of beef on my plate without tasting it. After that evening, Natalie began appearing more often at family gatherings. Each time she came, she brought gifts for my parents: Italian wine, French perfume, or artisanal cookbooks from renowned regions. My mother put them away carefully in the cabinet and would occasionally take them out to show the neighbors. That Natalie is so tasteful. She understood me at first sight, my mother said once, and I overheard it in the kitchen. I'm not a jealous person. I only found it strange. Natalie wasn't merely trying to win them over. She seemed unusually familiar with the value system in my family, something an outsider would not grasp so quickly. She always seemed to know exactly what to say to please my mother while gently nudging me out of the light. One afternoon, while the family was having tea on the porch, Natalie suddenly said, I really like Gabriella. After all, she lives independently without ties. But sometimes I think if a woman stays alone for so long, it might be because she's too used to loneliness. Her remark cut through the layers of armor I had built around myself like a sharpened blade. A few relatives chuckled. My mother did not correct her. I sat there, gripping my porcelain cup as if it were the only thing anchoring me through this uninvited performance. I began to pay closer attention. Natalie never insulted me directly. Instead, she cleverly wove comments, situations, and comparisons that isolated me. At family meals, when I mentioned something about my work, Natalie would change the subject to her family's real estate projects, or joke that I work as hard as someone building a bird's nest. Everyone laughed. I did not. I also noticed Natalie had a habit of asking about my father's financial records, the value of our properties, and various investments. At a small gathering at the house, I overheard her ask my mother, "If I were a deputy asset manager for the family, would you feel reassured?" My mother smiled kindly and replied, "You're attentive and sensible. I would certainly feel much more at ease." No one mentioned my name. Even though I had drawn the plans for the house extension when my parents renovated the upstairs. Even though I had helped them handle the property tax paperwork 2 years earlier. Even though I was their daughter. It was as if those facts had never existed in their minds. I said nothing, made no objection, asked no questions. I just stood there by the kitchen window, still drying the last dish. The warm water on my hands cooled while a familiar, sharp feeling rose in my chest. I did not belong here. Natalie was clever. She didn't have to do much. She only needed to say enough, do enough, so that I would slip out of the narrow circle of affection that had always existed. She was taking root, slowly claiming the spaces I had tried to protect. The affection of my parents, the trust of relatives, and most importantly, the control over assets I had never wanted but had never imagined would be seized so coldly. I realized she didn't love Jacob. She loved what came with him, the family name, the property, the status. And she had chosen the savviest route, turning me into a faded shadow and quietly removing me from the game. The message from Natalie arrived on a late afternoon in May, while I sat in the office checking technical drawings for a school renovation project in Providence. My phone lit up with a single line, "Gabriella, I'd like to meet you privately before the wedding." A frank conversation, not about Jacob or mom and dad. I stared at the message without replying. My instinct told me to delete it and keep working as if nothing had appeared. But another part of me, the part that had seen my mother's face when Natalie spoke, the part that had stood on the sidelines for years, wanted to know clearly, what did she really want? I typed a simple reply, "Time and place." Natalie chose an Italian-style cafe in Beacon Hill. It was quiet and elegant without being flashy. I arrived on time and stepped into a rustic space with soft jazz playing. She was already there, seated in the corner, a cream-colored coat draped over the chair and an espresso steaming in front of her. I sat down without preamble. "What do you want from me?" Natalie looked up and smiled as if we were old friends reunited. "I want things to go smoothly on the wedding day." "I think you want that too." "And what does that have to do with me?" She put her hand on her purse and produced a thick envelope. "I'll be frank. Your presence at the wedding will make many people uncomfortable. Not only because of the history between you and the family but also for other reasons." I didn't touch the envelope. I only met her gaze. "What do you mean?" Natalie leaned in, lowering her voice. "You might think I'm audacious, but I know you're clever. I know you've overheard conversations in the house. I know you sense the smallest movements. And I believe you understand how precarious your position in the Davis family is." I kept my expression neutral. But each sentence she spoke felt like a stone dropped into a still pool inside me. "So, you can help me and help yourself. I don't want trouble. I only want a peaceful wedding. You could choose not to attend. Consider it a final kindness." I smiled wryly. "Are you trying to bribe me?" "Call it a wedding gift from a considerate future sister-in-law," she replied, pushing the envelope toward me. I didn't open it. I gently pushed it back. "I don't need your money. I don't need anyone to define kindness for me." Natalie's smile stayed in place, but her eyes darkened. She tilted her head and slowly took her phone from her bag. The screen flashed with a stream of messages, images, and a short voice note that I didn't have time to read before she switched it off. "Do you think I only brought money? Well, I have a backup plan. Some people from your company have provided some unfavorable comments. One of them said you're uncooperative, stubborn, and frequently dismissive of others' ideas. What if someone accidentally sent that information to the boards overseeing the new projects you're involved in? I looked at her and felt a sinking, not of fear but of exposure to the rawness of the trap she'd laid. Natalie had not come to negotiate. She had come to warn. Have you prepared all this? I asked, my voice shifting from cool to weary. Natalie folded her hands, voice syrupy. You're an old piece in the new picture. I don't hate you, really. But you're standing in the path Jacob and I are building. And the funny thing is, you're not going to step aside. So I have to clear the way. Her words, wrapped in polite language, were a declaration of war. Not just about the wedding or reputation. This was a power play, and I was beginning to see she had far broader aims than simply becoming a daughter-in-law. I stood up. You want a peaceful wedding? You'll have it. But not the way you imagine. Natalie tilted her head with a knowing smile. I hope you make the right choice. Every choice has consequences. I walked out of the cafe without looking back. I felt neither flustered nor afraid. What I felt was a clarity I had never owned. She had written the script, honed the lines, staged the set. But she had forgotten one thing. I had spent a lifetime in silence and I could read the masks people put on and take off. And what I was more certain of than anyone was this. If someone had to leave the table, it would not be me. I entered the Astoria Hotel's wedding hall when the clock read near 2 p.m. The ceiling soared above, hung with hundreds of crystal bulbs that glittered. Pearl-colored tablecloths and pale blue hydrangeas in tall glass vases filled the grand room like an orchestra. Everything was luxurious, flawless, like the set of a fairy tale wedding. I wore the navy blue gown I'd chosen. Simple, unassuming. No one greeted me. There were no directions, no place card at the reception desk as there usually are. I went up to the check-in and asked the attendant, "Excuse me, my name is Gabriella Davis. I'm here for Jacob and Natalie's wedding." The young woman frowned, scanned the list, and looked puzzled. "I don't see your name on the seating chart, ma'am." I was still for a few seconds, feeling a dull ache at my forehead. "Could you please double-check?" After another check, she replied apologetically, "I'm so sorry. There must have been an error in the seating arrangement." I nodded and smiled politely, but inside I understood. It wasn't an error. It was deliberate. I moved into the guest area. Every table was full, voices lively. I looked around, relatives I hadn't seen in 10 years, faces from the finance world my father used to work with. Everyone had a seat and a name card. Everyone except me. I lingered against a wall, unacknowledged. An older woman I called Aunt Helen passed by, glanced at me, and turned away as if she didn't recognize me. A former friend of Jacob's burst into loud conversation, then leaned over and whispered something to his group. They all broke into laughter. I stood there, clutching my purse strap, the ache radiating down my neck. Each line Natalie had delivered at the cafe replayed under the soft wedding music. Everything had become crystal clear. The bell rang to signal the ceremony. Guests turned toward the floral arch awaiting the bride. I stood at the back, silent like an uninvited shadow. But I did not leave. I had decided I would no longer turn away. Jacob appeared first, adjusting his tie, shaking a few hands along the aisle. He looked radiant, the picture of someone spoiled his whole life. Our eyes met for a flash, then he looked away as if he hadn't seen me. I wasn't surprised. Jacob had perfected the art of brushing away people. Natalie followed, an ivory gown hugging her figure, the train several meters long carried by bridesmaids. The guests applauded softly, a few audible oohs. She smiled, eyes forward, yet still scanned the room like someone checking reactions. The ceremony proceeded as scheduled. My parents sat in the front row, their faces proud as they watched their son and his bride. My mother turned to the person beside her, eliciting a chuckle, and flashed a quick look toward me, an expression both pitying and wary. When the speeches began, the MC invited Jacob to speak first. I expected the usual platitudes about love and gratitude, but in his opening sentence I sensed something was wrong. "Before I start married life, I want to address something that has been simmering for a while." Jacob held the microphone, his tone dropping. "A family member, my own sister, has taken advantage of our trust to seize assets. And recently she has been deliberately harassing my fiancé." The room fell into an almost absolute silence. I stood motionless as heads turned. Every eye was pulled toward me by an invisible force. Jacob pointed directly at me. Gabriella, I didn't want to expose this, but you have crossed the line. You have threatened Natalie, sent intimidating messages, and withdrawn money from the family account without authorization. The words struck my ears like a slap. Someone exhaled sharply. Someone else lifted up a phone. I heard murmurs behind me. Did she steal the money? How could she? She's an architect. Or is she unemployed now? Is that why? My mother stood up, showing no surprise. She looked at me, then turned to the crowd. Gabriella has been out of touch with the family for a long time. We tried to keep this quiet because we didn't want to affect either family's reputation. But today, when the truth can no longer be denied. I looked at her. In that gaze there was nothing of the mother who had once held my hand through my first winter. Only the coldness of someone playing out a role written long ago. Natalie left her place and stepped beside Jacob, her eyes rimmed red. I don't want to make a big deal of it, but I've been under so much pressure while preparing for the wedding. There were times I thought, maybe I shouldn't marry Jacob because I was afraid she would keep interfering. A pain rippled down my throat. Not because of the accusations themselves, but because everyone was silent. No one stood up to ask if it was true. No one asked for evidence. I opened my mouth, but my throat was dry. At that moment, a voice called out from the back, "Hold on." A male voice, clear and steady. The crowd stirred and turned. I saw Daniel moving down the aisles, holding a dark blue file. I hadn't yet found the words to speak. But somehow he arrived at the right time. Not to save me, but to clarify a truth they thought they could keep hidden forever. Daniel showed no haste. He walked to the center of the wedding hall with the calm of someone used to dismantling carefully staged performances. His charcoal gray suit fit his tall frame, his left hand held the neatly clipped file, and his right hand rested lightly on a jacket button as if to steady his own steady pulse. All eyes turned to him. The murmurs fell silent. The large room seemed to contract into a single lens focused on Daniel. "May I say a few words?" he said, not loudly, but firmly, and so that his voice carried across the room. The MC at the microphone looked flustered, glanced at Jacob and then Natalie. No one answered. No one stopped him. Daniel stepped forward, turned toward the guests, his gaze pausing on me for an instant. I stood there, my heart pounding, unsure what would happen next. But in Daniel's look was an assurance that made me breathe out as if I'd been holding my breath since the start of the ceremony. "My name is Daniel Reese, legal counsel at Hartwell Stone. I have also directly assisted Gabriella Davis on several sustainable development projects in the city of Boston over the past 3 years." He raised the file. "I am holding bank statements from Elmhurst Bank, where the Davis family set up a private trust for internal investments. These documents were sent to me by an anonymous third party with legitimate access. They contain clear evidence that a series of transactions totaling more than $200,000 were made over the past 8 months from Mr. Raymond Davis's account, Gabriella and Jacob's grandfather's account, to a personal account in the name of Jacob Davis." The room seemed to shatter and then freeze at once. Daniel continued, his voice steady, each word driving like a nail into the wooden floor. "What is notable is that none of those transactions were reported to the account owner, Mr. Raymond. The withdrawals were labeled as Emergency Investment Fund and accompanied by forged electronic signatures." My mother jumped to her feet. "Impossible. How could Jacob do such a thing?" Daniel looked at her, his tone unchanged. "Mrs. Mr. Raymond's electronic signature was accessed without authorization from an IP address registered to Jacob Davis's apartment in Manhattan. We have verified this. If necessary, we can request the bank's cooperation in an official investigation." By now Jacob's face had gone ashen. He stepped forward, his hand visibly shaking. "Who are you to interfere in my family's matters? This has nothing to do with you." Daniel did not budge. "I would not have intervened if Gabriella had not been publicly slandered, falsely accused of theft, and called the family's embarrassment, while she kept silent to avoid ruining a celebration." Natalie gripped Jacob's hand, her eyes wide as if she could not believe what was unfolding. I looked at her and saw nothing but a wall of makeup beginning to crumble under the harsh white lights. Daniel turned to me. "Gabriella, I apologize for not asking before speaking up. But I cannot let you continue to suffer for things you did not do. I looked at him, my throat tight. Not from emotion but from release. For years I had braced myself against vague accusations, distrustful looks, and the cruel silence of those closest to me. And today, in a place I had expected to be kept at the margins, someone walked straight into the center to speak the truth on my behalf. A woman rose from the middle row. I recognized her as Cynthia Blake, a longtime colleague of my father's. She walked toward Daniel. I'm one of those who were informed about that missing fund. Raymond had complained about temporary mismanagement of money and assumed it was a system error. If this is true, then we trusted the wrong person, she said. Her words popped the final lid off. The whispers were no longer hushed. They became clear conversations. I heard fragments like forgery, fraud, legal responsibility. Jacob tried to regain control by raising his voice. Everyone calm down. This is just a misunderstanding. I can explain. Daniel cut him off, his gaze sterner than I'd ever seen. Then explain why 3 weeks ago you and Natalie sent a threatening letter to Gabriella when she refused to take the hush money? Explain the threatening messages sent from a phone registered under Natalie's name. My mother turned to Natalie. Is that true? Natalie pressed her lips together, her face pale. All we did was protect this wedding from disruption, she said. I could not hold back. By pushing someone out of your lives? By fabricating stories, bribing, then pretending to be the victim? Natalie, if that's your method of protecting a marriage, perhaps the marriage itself should be reconsidered. No one applauded. No one laughed. But a few heads began to nod. My father's eyes landed on Daniel, then on me. There were no defenses, no anger, just a slow collapse in his gaze, like someone realizing the wall they'd built for years was hollow. While the tension in the hall still hung heavy from the overturned accusations, I heard the soft tap of a cane on the wooden floor behind me. The small, steady sound cut through the murmur like a drumbeat in a solemn ceremony. People turned. An older man rose from the back row. I recognized him immediately. William Carrington, my grandfather's lifelong friend and co-founder of the firm Davis Carrington back in the 1960s. His shoulders were slightly stooped, but he still carried the dignity of someone who had guided a generation of architects with intellect and integrity. He paused before the front row and scanned the room. Everyone fell silent. No one dared interrupt as William spoke. I apologize for interrupting such an event, but there are matters I must speak of today or I will not rest, he said. He turned to my father. The warmth of old friendship was gone from his eyes. Raymond, do you remember the promise at Samuel's bedside? I watched my father press his hand against the armrest and his eyes shift. William did not wait for an answer. He reached into his coat and took out an old paper envelope, its edges yellowed, sealed with a classic red wax. Those nearby leaned in to see. This is a copy of Samuel Davis's original will, Gabriella and Jacob's grandfather. The original is held at the law office Whitaker Cole and has been sealed for 3 years. I have custody of this copy at his express request. He looked at me and his expression softened. Gabriella, you may not have known, but when you were 24 your grandfather came to see me. He said he was reconsidering the entire plan for dividing his estate. Not out of unfairness, but because he had seen who truly had the sense of responsibility in this family. Each word felt like a breeze blowing open a long-locked door. I stood motionless. Natalie's frown deepened. She looked at Jacob, then at my parents. My mother bowed her head, saying nothing. My father stared at the envelope in William's hand as if it contained a ticking bomb. In this will, William continued, Samuel declares that he bequeaths all real estate held in his name, including 3 houses, the Vermont farm and 2 trust accounts, to Gabriella Davis, his eldest granddaughter, the person he believed best understood the value of labor, prudence, and decency. A sharp exhale echoed somewhere in the crowd. I heard Natalie stamp her heel lightly, then whisper something to Jacob. He remained silent, his face gone white. William turned back to my father. Raymond, you promised me and your own father you would announce this will according to his wishes. But you hid it. You let Gabriella live years in obscurity while your life's work, the estate he built, was handed out according to your whims. My father offered no rebuttal. He only looked down at the floor as if avoiding the crack he himself had made and could not bear to face. You even had Jacob sign a transfer of the Vermont land under the pretext of internal authorization, William added, his voice dropping. I know because the witnessing attorney is an old student of mine. He asked my opinion on the legality of that document, and I advised him to refuse. Natalie no longer wore her composure. If you all think grandfather leaving everything to Gabriella is reasonable, then why didn't he tell the family sooner? Why involve an outsider like you? William's gaze turned sharp as a blade. Miss Natalie, the outsider you mention is the man who co-founded the firm with Samuel, who stood by him for 25 years, who witnessed every rise and fall in this family. You, however, have only been here 3 months and already want to claim the treasure map. Natalie's face drained of color. Jacob was about to speak, but William raised a hand to stop him. I do not want to prolong this. But one thing must be made clear. Gabriella was not only chosen by her grandfather to inherit the estate, she was chosen to inherit the Davis family's honor, a thing I could not bear to see unprotected if no one stood for it today. I stood still, my heart beating loudly as if I could not yet accept what I was hearing. My life had been filled with criticisms, omitted from family photos, forgotten at dinners, excluded from embraces and decisions. Yet here, in front of those who had once treated me like a shadow, someone who had held the truth for years had chosen to stand up for me. I looked at my father. This time he did not turn away. His gaze was not angry nor remorseful. It was utter helplessness. The way a man who once controlled everything now found himself standing on ground that no longer belonged to him. My mother would not meet my eyes. She turned to Jacob and said something softly. Jacob nodded, his expression empty. Natalie still would not sit. I don't believe this. This is a setup. Who would leave everything to a woman who keeps to herself, unmarried, childless, uninvolved with the family? I looked straight at her, my voice calm. Maybe because my grandfather didn't want someone loud. He only wanted someone who keeps their word. And in that moment, amid sighs and the quiet glances around me, I realized that the silence I had carried for years was finally answered. It was not a scream. It was the truth revealed in the calmest of voices. The large glass doors at the end of the hall suddenly opened. Everyone turned as a tall man with salt and pepper hair, standing as straight as an oak, strode in, his leather shoes clicking on the marble floor. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, just a neatly folded white pocket square. No introduction was needed. Every eye recognized him. Charles Whitmore, Natalie's father, founder of the investment firm Whitmore Holdings, a figure financial magazines called A Cold Wind Across Wall Street. Natalie froze when she saw him. Her face went pale, her lips pressed tight as if trying to hold something back. Jacob was motionless, his eyes darting as if searching for an exit in a room with no doors. Charles looked at no one but his daughter. His voice was low and hoarse, clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. Natalie, do you have anything to explain to your father, right now? Natalie stepped back a pace. I don't know what they're saying. All those accusations are baseless. Charles glanced at William, then at Daniel, and finally at me. He inclined his head slightly. I heard from outside. It's enough so this can't be called a misunderstanding. Natalie hurried forward, her voice urgent, like an actress reciting a line she'd memorized. I only tried to protect Jacob. Everything was because I thought Gabriella was trying to ruin my life and his. Charles did not change expression. And you think that gives you the right to forge evidence, hire people to send anonymous letters, or bribe lawyers to work around financial agreements? Natalie shook her head, her eyes rimmed red. I didn't hire anyone. I just wanted things to go the right way. Jacob said he wouldn't get his share, and Gabriella. You never once asked me about the truth, Charles cut in, his voice not raised but enough to hush the room. We can overlook many things. But if you deliberately trample this family's honor to seize someone else's property, you are writing your own indictment. The room grew so quiet I could hear the click of a woman's fingernail behind me. Jacob lowered his gaze. Natalie grabbed her father's hand, her voice trembling. Dad, I did this for my future. I thought if I married Jacob, if my name was on the Davis property, I would. What would you do? Charles did not let go of her hand. Make Gabriella disappear from your life like an old thing? My daughter, I taught you how to build value, not how to stage a drama as if you run a TV show. Natalie let go, clutched her gown, her face flushed with anger and shame. She looked up, her voice high-pitched. Well, where is he? He pointed at Jacob. Where is he? Why isn't he speaking? Everyone looked toward Jacob. He was no longer there. A server quietly stepped up, whispered to Daniel, then stepped back. Daniel turned to me and spoke loud enough for the room to hear. Jacob left the hotel through a side exit right after Mr. Whitmore arrived. He took his car and left without leaving a note. The tension that had already hung in the air now felt blade sharp. Natalie looked around and found no one on her side anymore. She sobbed softly and wiped her face, but no one believed those tears. Some guests began to stand. The older ones sighed. The younger glanced at one another and quietly reached for their wallets. Within minutes, the sounds of chairs shuffling, heels tapping, and silk rustling replaced the laughter the wedding should have had. A group of family acquaintances approached William to bid him farewell and then left. A woman leaned to her husband and whispered, "We shouldn't stay. It's bad for appearances." I stood still. Not joyful. Not angry. Only a silence like a lake after rain. Natalie remained, eyes unfocused, lips trembling. The expensive dress no longer made her stand out. In the eyes of the crowd, she was simply a defeated figure exposed on her own stage. Charles stepped forward and put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "I will not abandon you, Natalie. But you must face the consequences of your actions. I taught you to step into the world on your own feet, not to climb over the backs of others." Natalie did not respond. She retreated and walked slowly toward the backstage area. A hotel staff member took the stage, flustered, and whispered into the MC's ear. Seconds later, an announcement, trying to keep decorum though everyone knew what had happened, came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unexpected change from the host family, the ceremony will conclude early. We sincerely apologize to our guests and will arrange transportation out of the area in the next few minutes." I closed my eyes for a moment and felt my heart's steady beat. Daniel's soft voice was at my ear. "Are you okay?" I turned to him and nodded. I didn't expect any of this to happen. Daniel smiled, his tone gentle. But it needed to happen. I looked at the floral arch set up that morning, now tilted from someone brushing against it. Hydrangea petals lay scattered on the glossy floor. No one cared about the dinner, the band, or the 3-tier cake sitting in the kitchen refrigerator. No one thought of today as a wedding anymore. It had become an unofficial courtroom where hidden things were forced into the light. And the person who had been pushed out of the game finally had a voice to speak for herself. The morning after the ruined wedding, I sat alone in the small kitchen of my month-to-month Riverside apartment. Sunlight filtered through the white curtains and cast shadows on the scratched wooden table. A cup of black tea steamed on the table and a letter from William's law office lay open atop a copy of the will. I did not reread it. There was no need. Every line had already etched itself into my memory the night before when William handed it to me in the car back from the hotel. His hand trembling slightly, his eyes resolute. He said, "Keep it as part of the truth they hid from you all these years." I did not feel triumphant. I only felt as if something had been pulled from my chest, leaving a cold void. Near noon the phone rang. My mother's name lit the screen. I watched it ring until it stopped. A minute later it rang again. Then a text came, "Mom is sorry. Can you come home to talk with us?" I stared at the message for a long time. The short words, probably typed in haste without punctuation, strangely did not anger me. They only made me tired. That afternoon I decided to go see them. Not to forgive, but to close the chapter. The childhood home sat quietly in the sun, the front door still a faded beige, dust on the brass knob. When I stepped inside, my mother sat on the sofa and my father stood by the window with his hands in his pockets. They didn't greet me. They watched as if searching for some familiar version of me. "Sit down," my mother said softly. I did not sit. I came only to make one thing clear. My father cleared his throat, trying to appear composed. "First, we want to apologize. We were wrong." I did not respond. My mother continued. "We never thought you would be hurt like this. We only thought you were stronger. You didn't need those things, like Jacob needed." I looked at her, her eyes avoided mine. "Do you mean I don't need recognition? Don't need to be treated fairly? Don't need to be loved?" She pressed her lips together, offering no answer. My father spoke. "It's all in the past. Now you can keep everything your grandfather left. We won't argue. If you want to share some with Jacob, then. I cut him off. No. They both looked up. My father frowned. You will share nothing, I said each word clearly. Not because I'm spiteful, but because this is my grandfather's wish. He trusted me. I will not let anyone twist that. But you don't need to keep it all, my mother pleaded, her voice almost a plea. Family is sharing. It's about giving. I smiled thinly. I shared for 30 years. I shared every scholarship dollar to get by while Jacob was raised like a favored son. I shared silence to keep peace, lowered my gaze so others could hold their heads high. I have given my share of yielding. Now the keeping belongs to me. They said nothing. I went on. I will not sue. I will not take anyone to court. But as of today, I am no longer part of this house. My mother began to cry. But there were no tears that could pull me back. For years they had had chances to keep me close. They chose to miss them. I turned and walked to the door. As my hand touched the knob, my father called out, not with his usual commanding voice, but with a weariness in it. Gabrielle, we are getting old. One day. I looked back at him, meeting his eyes. I will not let anyone be abandoned. But I will not let myself be hurt any longer. The door closed softly behind me, not with a slam but with a quiet that felt like the period at the end of an old chapter. I stepped outside, the wind brushing my shoulders, carrying fragments of dusty memories. I did not feel lighter. But something had been set down. And I walked away without looking back. Not to leave but to begin. The days after the wedding were strangely quiet. No calls came from my family, no messages, no blaming or explanations. That silence was no longer a wound. It became space to breathe, a necessary pause to sort through the upheaval. I returned to work and continued finishing the community library project in South Boston, the last project my grandfather had ever mentioned in his old notebook, where he had written, not just a place to hold books, but a place to hold collective memory. I poured my heart into every detail, from the way natural light slips through the large windows to the height of the chairs in the reading area for seniors. Every floor tile, every line in the construction drawings felt like an extension of a legacy I had once believed I would never touch. One late afternoon while I was at the construction site, Daniel showed up. He wore a rolled-up shirt, no tie, and carried my favorite coffee from the cafe near the office. He didn't say much. He simply stood beside me as I supervised the workers setting the steel ribs of the vaulted roof. As the light faded, I turned and caught his gaze. Something between us had shifted beyond polite colleague courtesy. You should know, he began, his voice soft like an autumn breeze. I once asked to transfer to the North Branch just for a chance to work with you. I tilted my head at him, both surprised and amused. You're serious? He nodded without taking his eyes off me. Back then I was just a project attorney in training. You were the woman everyone in the meeting room fell silent to listen to. But it was how you looked at the technical drawings, the way you defended each timber post and every corner, that made me believe there's a world where work is done with the whole heart. I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because a part of me had long feared words like that might be illusions. I used to think someone like me didn't need admiration. Doing good work was enough. But standing there before Daniel, amid an unfinished building and the distant rhythm of hammers, I realized some feelings only need the right person at the right time to take root. I didn't want you to see me as the one who only stepped in to defend you that day. I'd watched you for a long time, but I didn't dare approach, afraid I'd be just another person passing through your life. I asked quietly, and now? Daniel smiled gently as if making a promise. Now I'm here, not to pass through but to walk with you. I looked away and pretended to study the crane, but something inside me had already begun to stir. It wasn't immediate love exactly, but a real aching resonance. I didn't answer him that day. I needed time, not to weigh things but to let myself believe I deserved a part of life free from inner doubts. A few months later, the library was complete. On opening day, I wore a white shirt and stood before rows of elder residents from the neighborhood, eager children on the reading rug, and the colleagues who had been with me from the first phase. Daniel stood beside me, his eyes on me even though he had been invited to the honored seating. When I spoke, I didn't mention the will or my family. I spoke of my grandfather, a quiet man who believed that knowledge and kindness must be built with the hands and heart. After my speech, I walked to the back of the building, where I had signed the interior brick wall before it was plastered. I stood and took in the whole project from the small courtyard, where a breeze stirred the newly planted maples. Daniel came up silently and stood beside me. I turned to him, and for the first time I didn't avoid his eyes. Maybe you were right. Not everyone who comes is meant to leave. He didn't answer with words, he simply took my hand. I tightened my grip on his. In front of us stood the building, its gilded arches warm in the late sun, a structure I had designed. Each line was no longer the mark of a former pupil but the declaration of a person standing firmly on her own 2 feet. I inhaled deeply, my eyes fixed on the work. The past no longer binds me. I am free to write my life anew. And I began to write, from this very place. No longer someone else's shadow, no longer the quiet keeper of an old house, no longer the name erased from the guest list. I was Gabriella Davis, the one who kept a promise to my grandfather and finally the one who kept a promise to myself. I don't know how everyone will view my story. Some may pity a broken family, others may relish the unmasking of deceit, some may judge me harshly for being too firm, too resolute. But if it were you, what would you do when your own family treats you like a burden, when those closest to you deliberately exclude you from life's key decisions? When you stand in a room full of fake applause and baseless accusations, do you stay silent or do you stand up for yourself? I don't seek praise for being strong. I only believe that if you don't write your own story, others will write it for you with pages full of lies. Sometimes walking away from those who hurt you is the first step to finding people who truly see you. If you've ever felt forgotten, ever stood among family and still felt alone, I want you to know you are not by yourself. Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Would you forgive or move on? And if you're drawn to emotional true stories about complicated families, hard choices, and journeys toward healing, subscribe so we can continue this journey together. Life is full of unexpected turns, and each of us has the right to write our own ending.